Right, this is Michael Kochin. I'm a associate professor at Tel Aviv University. I'd like to give you an update and some perspective on the current war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. It's Thursday, October 12th, around 2 p.m. Everything is changing all the time. And so in terms of current events, we can only talk about what's already been reported. In terms of perspective, of course, that's the advantage, right? Is if we get a little perspective, we can understand the current events a little better, hopefully. I don't speak for Tel Aviv University. I don't have any official connection to any part of the Israeli government or army. These are my opinions and views, and they are not based on any secret information or rumors or any of that. Just what's been reported and on my own research and writing about the Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the last 30 years or so. Now, you probably all know the basic outline of what happened. Saturday morning, early Saturday morning, Hamas attacked from the Gaza Strip at a number of locations. So far, more than 1,300 Israelis have been killed. Almost the vast majority of them, over 1,000 of them, civilians. Number of hostages, 197, according to one report, have been taken to the Gaza Strip. And the Israeli army is striking back. It's cleared the terrorists out of its territory and has launched a great many airstrikes into Gaza. Right now, it appears that while 300,000 plus reservists have been called up to the IDF, it does not appear that the Israeli army has yet to start massive ground operations, though there's been a lot of bombing of selected targets. Now, it's important to understand that we've seen this kind of thing before, but not in a long time. What's happened is effectively the biggest ever, bigger than all of them put together, but a Fedayeen raid, a raid by armed militants whose mission is to kill as many people as they can, men, women, children, soldiers, civilians. Adding the capture of hostages is a new thing, I think. It's something that was only possible really for Palestinian movements once on this kind of scale, once they got their own territory. But in terms of this sort of attack, we've seen this sort of attack before, but not in a long time. And to start with perspective, I think it's good, it's helpful if I bring up a conversation I had a long time ago, back in the 90s, with my then colleague, Dr. Gil Merom, who wandered off to teach at the University of Sydney in Australia, and who I haven't spoken to for many years. But I said to Dr. Merom at the time, I said, what stops the Palestinians from launching an attack on Israeli targets, on Israeli forces? We've made a government. They've built an army of sorts. And they can concentrate force at a given point greater than Israel can concentrate. Greater than Israel can have at any possible point of attack. The attackers get to choose the time, they get to choose the place. It's simply not possible, regardless of intelligence warnings, for Israel every time to concentrate sufficient force at every possible location of attack. Eventually, the bad guys get lucky. Eventually, Israel's surprised, and that surprises happen should not itself be a surprise. And Dr. Merom said to me, yeah, of course they can do such a thing. Of course they can launch such an attack. But then the question is, what will happen to them after that? How will they be punished? In other words, what has prevented such attacks in the decades since 1970 has been Israel's ability to retaliate. Okay? That eventually stopped such attacks from Egypt, or from Egyptian-held territory in the Gaza Strip. It eventually stopped such attacks from Jordan. It stopped such attacks from Syria, and it stopped such attacks from Lebanon, even after the Lebanese government came to be dominated by Hezbollah. Hezbollah has launched indiscriminate attacks against civilians, but they haven't launched this kind of armed raid against civilian targets with the objective to shoot, behead, kidnap as many civilians as possible. So if you want to understand why these things don't happen anymore or hadn't happened until just now, right, you have to think about deterrence. The way that Israel deterred these attacks, built deterrence to these attacks, was by reprisals, reprisal raids. The reprisal raids were conducted against military targets, and they were conducted against civilian targets. Okay? And at the time, in the 50s and 60s, they were very controversial in international law. Israel did not deliberately kill civilians, but they did send troops in to destroy civilian targets, blow up houses, and so forth. Sometimes the civilians had adequate time to evacuate, and sometimes they didn't. But these reprisal raids were effective at persuading the governments that controlled territory to stop Palestinian fighters from launching raids into Israel. Okay, and thus they secured quiet on Israel's borders. Obviously, Hamas was not deterred from launching this attack or this series of attacks. Why were they not deterred? One explanation some people will give you is because they're fanatics. But even that we need to unpack and try to understand. I think also there's an international diplomatic picture that will make things a bit clearer. Now, if you look, if you compare the fanaticism thing, you compare the Palestinian and Israeli national movements, it's important to understand a very basic difference between them. Ever since Ben-Gurion took over the Zionist organization around 1930, the Zionist organization and then Ben-Gurion as leader of the State of Israel were focused on one matter above all, which is building the strength, the might, the power, the governing ability of the State of Israel. That's what Ben-Gurion called mamlachtiyut. That was his highest goal. It was more important than any Zionist goal, than any Jewish goal, than any socialist goal, even though Ben-Gurion was, of course, a Zionist, a Jew, and a socialist. Quite controversially, it was more important than rescuing Jews during the Holocaust. Now, what Ben-Gurion wanted to build was an independent state of Israel, as powerful as he could manage, and therefore as free and independent as he could manage. Every choice Ben-Gurion made, whether in domestic politics, in foreign politics, in building the army, in what he wrote, and he wrote a great deal, in what he read, in what translations he encouraged and helped to sponsor, was intended to build the power of the State of Israel. Okay? To create a Jewish state, and as powerful a Jewish state as he could attain. That attitude, Ben-Gurion tried to convey that attitude to everybody else, including the public at large, and his success was real but limited. Okay, he had rivalry from ideological socialists, from territorial maximalists, who both in socialist and non-socialist or anti-socialist or liberal parties, like Menachem Begin. He had his critics on the extreme left and on the extreme, extremists, on the left and the right, often criticized his policies as Machiavellian, as immoral, as corrupt. Begin attacked Ben-Gurion for being willing to deal with Germany, to receive reparations payments from Germany. Ben-Gurion was willing to do this in order to build up the state and build up the Israeli economy to strengthen the state. Ben-Gurion gave this purpose, he called it Yi'ud in Hebrew, this purpose to the Zionist movement. He gave it to the State of Israel. And he was successful at building a state of the Jewish people. in the land of Israel, in Palestine. The Palestinian national movement is a very different story. While one of the goals of the Palestinian national movement has been to build up an independent state of the Palestinian people in Palestine, that has never been their overriding, most important goal to which everything else ought to be sacrificed. Okay? The Palestinian parties have generally been revolutionary. Some of them have been Islamic revolutionaries. Some of them have been socialist revolutionaries. And they've always put revolutionary goals ahead of national goals, of Palestinian national goals. Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and like the Muslim Brotherhood as a whole, it has as its goal a worldwide Islamic caliphate. Okay, so both Hamas and Fatah, right, run governmental entities. Hamas runs Gaza, the Gaza Strip. The Fatah party runs the Palestinian Authority. They've never run them with a view toward building them as independent states or as parts of an independent Palestinian state as a goal overall. Okay? The Palestinians, for example, in the West Bank have not erected a meaningful tax structure. Okay? They rely on foreign aid to pay the salaries of their workers and pay for the weapons that their police are allowed to have. They haven't succeeded in collecting revenues that are substantial compared to their expenditures. Hamas also heavily relies on foreign aid from Iran, from Qatar. It does tax trade, but mostly it relies on foreign aid. Hamas spokesman was just on Russian television saying that the Israelis thought that they would be burdened with the government of Gaza, and we chose instead to emphasize war against Israel, and that's why we were able to do this operation, because the Israelis had no idea that we would make this kind of thing a priority over governing Gaza. So the Palestinian national movement, right, has other goals than an independent state of Palestine. Okay? The goals: killing Jews, taking land back from the Jews, advancing socialist revolution in the case of some Palestinian parties, Islamic revolution in the case of other Palestinian parties such as Hamas. Okay? So when pundits say this war shows that the two-state solution is dead, right? What the great grain of truth at the heart of that observation is it demonstrates that Hamas, the most powerful Palestinian political party and the party that rules in Gaza, has other priorities than building up an independent state of Palestine. An independent state of Palestine, at the end of the day, would have to accept the same obligations as other states. If it hadn't succeeded in destroying Israel, it would eventually have to live at peace with Israel, under some conditions, under some settlement, under some partition of territory. Okay? And that is what the Hamas, and in its own way Fatah, reject. That's the two-state solution that they reject. They both reject the notion of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. That means that any peace process based on the notion that the Palestinian political parties, as they are today, will lead the Palestinians to an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, any such notion of the peace process is not going to work from where we are. Okay? This has been tried, right? And it hasn't worked. Why was it tried? Let's go back to what I said before about the Fedayeen raids. What stopped the Fedayeen raids? Israeli retaliation convinced the governments of the territories from which the raids were launched that the raids did not accomplish goals that were worth the cost that Israel imposed on them. Okay, Israeli retaliation punished the states for hosting these Palestinian forces, allowing these raids, and convinced these governments that their goals as states, their most important goals, to defend their people, to rule their own country, to participate as respectable states in the world community of states. Right? All these goals could not be accomplished if they allowed the Palestinians to wage their peculiar kind of war against the Jews. The idea of the Oslo process was to create a Palestinian state that would eventually learn to behave the way other Arab states have learned to behave. Okay? The story of this peace process, so-called, is that over 30 years, the Palestinians have not changed their goals. They have not made building a Palestinian state their first priority, because to make it their first priority, it would be a Palestinian state alongside Israel. So that's where we are, right? No major Palestinian political party endorses a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Not Fatah, not Hamas, at the end of the day. Fatah hems and haws, Fatah hedges, but at the end of the day, they too, as we can see from the reaction of their so-called militant wings to the Hamas's attack, they too have other goals more important than an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. So Hamas did these things because it could. Okay, and it could do it. Why could it do them? Well, some people want to say the time for recrimination. It's too early for recriminations. How did Israel fail? But from the big picture, right, failures are going to happen. Any system will fail. Any method of intelligence has its limits. Hamas is a government. They have an army. Governments and armies can do this kind of thing. What keeps them from doing this kind of thing? The threat of retaliation, as Gil Merom pointed out so long ago. Why didn't then, let's come back to the question, why didn't Hamas fear retaliation? Partly, no doubt, they expected that the international community would restrain Israel from effective retaliation. Right? And obviously, if from one point of view, Israel hasn't retaliated to previous Hamas attacks effectively in the past, so why should the future be different from the past? Some people will point to the 2006 Lebanon war when Hezbollah attacked Israel. Israel responded. To some people's minds, that war ended inconclusively. But there are two lessons of that war that are not widely understood, and I don't think were understood by Hamas. The first lesson, if you look very carefully through, for example, the testimonies given to the Winograd Commission that investigated the war, there was no substantial international pressure on Israel not to do any of the things that the Israelis really wanted to do. This was a surprise to Israel. The Israelis did not expect this. Their planning before the war and their choices during the war, for almost all of the war, reflected the notion that just now, the international community, the Security Council, the United States, France, will intervene to keep us from continuing operations against Hezbollah. In fact, in 2006, both the presidents of the United States and the presidents of France were perfectly willing to see Israel make as much war against Hezbollah as it wanted. They were, whatever Israel was willing to do to Hezbollah, they were in Lebanon. They were perfectly happy to see happen, and there was no red light until late in the war. In order to end the war, Israel asked for a kind of fake diplomatic pressure to be introduced. This is all in the testimonies to the Winograd Commission. So, in fact, there was no pressure to stop operations against Hezbollah, and Israel stopped operations against Hezbollah based on its own notion of its goals being met. Okay, what were those goals? Those goals were to degrade Hezbollah military capacity and to deter Hezbollah from operating in the future. Now, one reason why people don't really understand those goals is that the prime minister at the time, Ehud Olmert, did not understand that those were the goals of the war. He did not understand that the plans that he was proposed by the chief of staff, approved in the cabinet, had those as the goals. The defense minister understood. The foreign minister understood, the chief of the general staff understood, but the prime minister did not understand, did not adequately explain the war, did not give the kind of rhetorical political support to the armed forces that they needed for people to understand what they were doing. But in fact, if we look, in terms of reestablishing deterrence, the Israeli operations in 2006 were pretty much successful, right, up till now. Right? We keep hearing threats every day about some massive operation, but in fact, Hezbollah has not engaged in any large-scale attacks in this so far in this conflict, or since the end of the 2006 war. Okay? They've confined operations to a few locations. That's because Hezbollah can only act in terms of colorable Lebanese goals. Right? Their position in Lebanon depends on their being perceived as the Lebanese government officially declared them, the defender of Lebanon. If they were to attack from Lebanon in pursuit of non-Lebanese goals, world Islamic revolution, killing Jews for the sake of killing Jews, they would lose their legitimacy in Lebanon and lose enough of their capacity to operate that they've never done that. They've never done any of those things, not from Lebanese territory. So they would have to have colorable Lebanese goals. The only colorable Lebanese goals that Hezbollah has been able to act in favor of is fighting over a few tiny disputed territories, Mount Dov and Sheba Farms along the border. Occasionally they do things, very rarely. Now, recently, there's in the last few days, they've done a little bit, but very small scale, very confined, and nothing like the kind of operation they launched in 2006, much less what they did, what Hamas just did. Along the Gaza border. Okay, so the Hamas looked at this. So Hamas was not deterred. Okay, perhaps they fear that they don't fear Israeli retaliation because they think Israeli retaliation will be restrained by the international community. So far, the signs are that that's probably not going to be the case. Israel will be able to do what it wants without substantial international pressure. And the question is what Israel wants, but Israel will be able to do what it wants. But I think there's another reason why they didn't fear retaliation that's important to recognize. And that is that as rejectionists, they fear peace. Not peace with the Palestinians, which is not a realistic prospect until some dominant Palestinian political force wants a Palestinian state alongside Israel, sets that as its primary goal. But in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, masterminded by President Trump and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, right, Israel has made peace with some of the Gulf states and has increasingly moved towards peace with Saudi Arabia. Okay, if the Saudis decide that peace with Israel is their number one diplomatic priority, and if they are willing, which is not clear, to engage in some difficult things to maintain that peace, then the flow of resources to Hamas could be shut off, right? Saudi Arabia is a relatively powerful country. A bit of squeezing of Qatar, the big patron of Hamas in the Gulf, would greatly reduce the flow of resources to Hamas. Peace breaking out would make Hamas a lot weaker. The capacities they've developed with the help of Iran, they would lose over time. So, in my view, Hamas was faced with a question of use it or lose it. And they chose to use it. They could not be deterred, because if they did nothing, they would be substantially weaker in the near future than they were last week. So they chose to act before the peace being woven with Saudi Arabia, right, and the possibility of Saudi pressure on Qatar and Saudi assistance in cutting off the flow of supplies from Iran, before these things could weaken Hamas, right? So they chose to act when they could. It's also possible that they had some actionable intelligence. We'll maybe know that from the Commission of Inquiry yet to come. Maybe we'll know that in the next year or two, maybe not. But I think that the main reason they weren't, I think, my personal opinion, that they weren't afraid of retaliation, was that they were going to lose. They faced the prospect of losing without a war. So they preferred to fight a war and possibly lose to losing without a war. Okay, the same motivation motivated the Japanese to launch Pearl Harbor, right? U.S. oil sanctions, 1941, in response to the brutal Japanese war against China, persuaded the Japanese that their economy and thus their military power was going to be degraded drastically if they didn't act. And so they did act and attacked the United States to cripple it, to give them time to seize resources in East Asia that would enable them to continue to fuel, quite literally fuel their military machine. Right? But now, so the next question, of course, to be asked is, okay, if all this is correct, what is to be done? What is to be done? Okay. Now, the question is there any way that Israel can retaliate in such a fashion as to regain deterrence against Hamas, if they ever had it? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I'm not sure that Hamas is deterrable. They don't seem to be interested in governing, not as a first priority. Therefore, they cannot be deterred the way states can be deterred. They are fundamentally, then, a terrorist group. Terror against Jews is their primary purpose, to which they are willing to sacrifice all else. But their ability to act from the Gaza Strip can be greatly degraded. And I expect that will be the goal of the large-scale Israeli operations yet to come. Okay, things can be destroyed, people can be killed. Perhaps sufficient destruction can persuade the public in Gaza not to tolerate Hamas. It's not clear that's within their capacity that they can do that, or they're interested in doing that. Right? The views of the major Palestinian political parties, right, that killing Jews is more important than building an independent Palestinian state, are widely shared in the Palestinian public, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. But in the West Bank, actual Israeli occupation has prevented the Palestinian political leadership from organizing anything like what we've just seen. Right? There were widespread attacks against Jews in the Second Intifada, and it was crushed. The Second Intifada was crushed by invasion and reoccupation of the West Bank. Gaza is going to be tougher. Can invasion and reoccupation of Gaza by Israel bring the same security to Israel that Operation Defensive Wall, Chomat Magen, brought in 2001? I don't know. But that's the first thing that Israel is going to try. Right? Israel's going to give it a shot. That as it gave it a shot in Lebanon, where in fact it worked. Rather, Israel's going to give. Let me go back on that. Israel's going to engage in massive operations with the goal of degrading and maybe deterring, not Hamas, which can't be deterred, but the Palestinian population, which probably can't be deterred either. What if that doesn't work? Right? Where do we go from here? Well, constructively, right, if the Palestinian people don't want to build a Palestinian state, then the only way there's ever going to be a Palestinian state is if somebody else builds it for them. Right? That's what used to be called colonialism, or the UN trusteeship system. And while when you call it those things, it sounds like it's something from the distant past. Something like this is being done, has been done in Bosnia and Kosovo in Europe. It's been done in East Timor. It could be done in Gaza if the international community has the will for it, if Israel is willing to go along with it, if the Palestinian political parties and their foreign backers in Iran and Qatar and so forth are not as so hostile to it as to make it impossible. Right? The UN couldn't reconstruct in Iraq or Afghanistan because the Iraqi resistance and the Taliban were too effective at killing UN personnel. Could the same be true in Gaza? Easily. But could the opposite be true in Gaza? Yes, if Palestinian political parties and their foreign backers are persuaded to sit quiet. Or persuaded how? Not, of course, by killing a lot of people, and, by sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a brief hint about the future. Right? So the future looks far away right now, and it is far away. We'll have to wait and see what Israel does once massive operations are launched, including ground operations, and how those operations go and what the response to them is in the Palestinian population and in the world.